you talked a lot about how we rely upon the superintendents of the US. And before the US were the world's leading superpower, it was, of course, Britain. And people have often said the only reason why Britain was ever a superpower and ever became wealthy was because it benefited from slavery. And that was why. And I want to know whether that's fact or fiction, Doug.
Well, so if you think about that, if slavery was the principal variable for wealth, yeah, one of the richest societies in the world right now would be Nigeria. So you had some of the largest black slaving kingdoms, the Kingdom of Dahomey, Sokoto Caliphate, in what's modern day Nigeria, millions and millions of black slaves. It's intra-African slavery. Same with Portugal. I think the Portuguese, I think in the transatlantic slave trade ran about 2/3 more in terms of the numbers of slaves taken and put into the colony, Brazil in particular. Right. So if slavery per se was the principal driver or the principal variable in terms of wealth, then one would expect to see other societies that have practiced slavery on a much, relatively speaking, GDP per capita basis, a much, much higher level than the Brits did. They should be, by their own nature, incredibly wealthy. Yeah. So there's lots of argument. The principle, I think, there's a kind of like what's called the Great Divergence. There's a massive academic literature on this. One of the principal, in terms of the academic literature, it tends to say one of the principal drivers of British wealth and the early advent, that kind of led up to the Industrial Revolution was the Black Death. So essentially what you had is about it was a third or even a half of the population of the UK, and I think it's the 1400s, I think it was, died. So what you had is that you had massive feudal land estates and had to essentially to incentivize workers to work and then pay them a lot more. So you had a much higher GDP per capita basis. So people had more disposable income and this kind of, so that was partly it. But obviously the most important thing was the Industrial Revolution, the first country to have the Industrial Revolution. And so that really generated loads of wealth. In terms of slavery, I think obviously there were, if you look at it, there were aristocrats and members of the elite, economic elite and political elite that benefited enormously on a personal level from slavery. So Edward Colston is the most famous example in Bristol. That statue was thrown in the River Avon, etc. So there are obviously individuals whose families benefited enormously from the disgusting trade in slaves. But in terms of Britain as a whole, as on an aggregate basis, I just don't think it's simply not sustainable. I think if you look at I think in the book, I can't remember the exact figures, but in 17 something, I can't remember which year it was, towards the end of the 1700s, was I think it was 1792, but I can't remember exactly, but it's like the principal year when there was most transatlantic slavery taking place from the Brits. In terms of what the naval capacity that dedicated to transshipment of slaves, it's about 3% of the entire kind of shipping that was owned by the Brits. So were there some individuals who made enormous amounts of money? Yes. But then even then you factor into the fact that you're talking about, we want a democracy, tiny elites were controlling this disgusting trade. And then as I'm sure you were aware, they were compensated by the British Exchequer. The 40% of, I think, national GDP was given over to pay the slave owners off, to accelerate the ending of slavery. Then post that, the Royal Navy was then dedicated, a large chunk of the Royal Navy was dedicated to ending slavery. So in terms of slavery, for a start, there was huge intra-African black slaving states, Kingdom of Dahomey, Sokoto Caliphate, etc., Zanzibar. The biggest slaver in human history is a guy called Tipu Tip. He had about 10,000 slaves on the Zanzibar plantations. He's an Afro-Omani. But so it's more about this idea that essentially white people are collectively guilty for the transatlantic slave trade, which I think is an absolutely disgusting assertion. It's completely, not only is it completely untrue, but you look at the conditions of social life at the time of the ending of slavery, let alone, the hundreds of years before, when it first got going. think about average age and mortality is about 35, mass slums, mass disease. White slaves were sent away as well. You know, the indentures, not the indentured labour, but also white slaves were sent away as well. The convicts were sent to Australia. So the idea that all white people, all white Brits benefit from slavery, or this country benefit from slavery, is just simply not sustainable.
Yeah, there's so many oversights, I suppose, in that slavery discussion. You touched there on the cost to the British taxpayer, not only for paying off the wealthy who were losing out on key streams of their revenue, but that Royal Navy, what's the right way of framing it? That Royal Navy effort to stamp out slavery that you talked about, that was something like 2% of Britain's GDP every year for 65 years to police the world's oceans, and not even the British Empire, is just everyone who might be contravening it.
Well, to think about the compensation to the slave, and people now use that as an example of why we're collectively guilty. It's the complete other way around. Essentially, you had very, very, very strong political and economic elite interests concentrating in Parliament. We were not a democracy, by the way. It's an aristocratic kind of elites who essentially resisted the abolition of slavery. So it was a way of the British government paying these people off to accelerate the ending of slavery. So the idea that, and absent that, you basically have given them money to end the disgusting trade in human souls. So it's compensation, but compensation designed to end it as quickly as possible. And that was 40% of GDP. Imagine what would have been done with that money. This is back then, we weren't as morally advanced, quote unquote, as we are now. Imagine 40% of GDP. The GDP in this country is about right. It's like today is a couple of trillion. I mean, that's
3 trillion, I think.
3 trillion. So, relatively speaking, and this is in the context of mass infant mortality, mass urban slums, desperate poverty, people living like 10 people in a room in the East End of London, where my family come from. Imagine what would have been done with that money. So that money, undemocratically, by the way, was used to pay off to end the transatlantic slavery. Imagine what we could have done with that money if we put that in, for example, the London slums, or the Glasgow slums, or the slums of up north.